This channel is supported by TrueFire. TrueFire is an online library of lessons from some of my favourite players. There's thousands of lessons on there. You can use the promo code JNC40 to get 40% off of any of their courses. So, obviously on this channel, I mean in real life, I'm a huge fan of line 6 and of the HX Stomp. It's kind of what I use most of the time, and for that reason I try to tell you as much as possible that that is probably, you know, if push came to shove and I was asked, you know, which would be your one kind of modeler, it would be HX Stomp. Now, I don't have an affiliation with line 6. I feel like that's sort of important to say, but I do use this most often. But someone asked in the comments, which would I choose out of an HX Stomp and a Hotone Ampero Stomp 2? And so I thought probably the easiest way to differentiate between the two would be the reasons that I wouldn't buy either. That makes sense. Reasons not to buy a Hotone Ampero Stomp 2 and reasons not to buy an HX Stomp, and see where we come up when comparing them, because there's a lot of similarities between these units, you know, 3 buttons and all that sort of stuff. So the main thing that I wouldn't buy a Hotone Ampero Stomp 2 would be is if I'm playing live, and that's my main kind of thing. The reason being, there's nothing quite like snapshots in it, and so for that reason it's a little bit more difficult to get the most out of these 3 buttons. And the other slight issue is that when you press any of these buttons, so for like tuner for example, it throws you into a different preset for a split second and can make a loud noise potentially. So say you were playing a clean part and you had some strings ringing out, you were just going to kick on a tuner. If it happened to be that underneath your tuner you had like a rhythm preset or something, that would momentarily get pressed, and that could be quite a big issue. Now, it wouldn't necessarily be something that Hotone, Hot One, whatever you want to call them, Hotone, are not able to solve with a firmware update, but for right now, I'd say that is a reason that you shouldn't buy that if you were concerned specifically for live use, along with not being super easy to set it up for gigging unless you only use kind of a limited array of sounds. For me, the superpower of the Helix HX Stomp is that you can set up parameter changes to happen easily across scenes, which they call snapshots in this world. So that's kind of the superpower of the HX Stomp. The reason that I wouldn't buy an HX Stomp, or a reason not to, and that you should buy a Hotone Ampero Stomp 2 if you're not using it live, would be if you're really interested in having more than 8 blocks. So this has 8 blocks potential that you could use. This has 12, and I think you'll find that it's more likely that you use up more blocks with this, even if you're doing dual amping. It's quite easy to come up against scenarios in the HX Stomp where you've maybe only been able to run sort of 4 blocks or something like that. You know, if you run an amp and a cab together on 2 amps, then sometimes it's very easy to think, right, well, I can't even now run a delay, reverb and drive alongside it. So there are real DSP limitations. You can work around those, and I do, by choosing different amp models, but that would be one reason I'd say that there's a bit of an advantage for the Ampero, because you can realistically run dual amp presets with a delay, reverb, a drive, maybe even a couple of drives, and you don't run up against that same DSP limitation. There are some other aspects to it, but that's it in a nutshell. The amp choices in both of these is really comprehensive. The effects choice in each of them is very good. Also, actually, if you're using pitch effects a lot, I think the Ampero Stomp has slightly inferior pitch effects. However, the pitch effects in this are great, but they use up almost half of the DSP available within it, or, you know, just under that, but they're very DSP intensive. So unless you were using only this for only pitch, then in the realistic gigging scenario for most individuals, if you had 3 or 4 other blocks with an amp, you're probably not going to get to use the pitch effects a whole lot. Whereas you can run them in this, but I don't think they sound as good as these. The effects choices in both of these is, again, pretty comprehensive. And again, it wouldn't be a thing I'd say, well, you shouldn't buy either of these because they don't have enough effects. They definitely do. The editors for these, PC editors, both really good. I think I give the edge for the Ampero Stomp. If you're wondering what was happening in the intro there, I kind of dialed in some tones that should have sounded vaguely similar through the same IR, through the same amp types. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, whether you preferred one or the other. Myself, personally, I feel like you can get really good tones out of these. So that was the easiest way that I thought that you could kind of think about it. Also, ease of use. I think I give the edge to the HX Stomp. I know this has a touch screen, but I find the capacitive interfacing, and if you haven't used an HX Stomp, maybe it's difficult to describe, but you can basically hold these and assign things pretty much instantaneously. It kind of just asks you, do you want to assign an effect to this? And you kind of just say yes, and you're going to stack multiple effects onto the same switch. There's a whole menu system in the Ampero Stomp, so I don't think the interface, although there is a touch interface, I don't think it's necessarily up to par with the Helix interface, which I think is probably the best interface in the modeling world, such that it is, especially if you discount people that just copied the Helix. So those are some thoughts. I wanted to get into the nitty gritty and show you some stuff on screen. In terms of, do the amps in one or the other sound better, I think you could probably take either and get really great tones, so that's not really a huge consideration for me any longer. You know, I think you can dial in great tones with both. I hope that makes sense. So the Hotone Ampero has a touch screen, which is pretty cool. This is kind of the edit screen, so I'm just on an empty thing for now. Now, one of the things that I thought might be the case when I bought this, you've got the potential for 12 blocks here, right? You used like one of these templates, so you could either go all in here, and you've got 2 processors essentially. So you could have 2 totally different blocks that then join up here, or you could have parallel, so just 2 separate paths altogether. You can have split, then a mix. Now the issue with the split and the mix is, so say you wanted to have certain things before the amp, the issue is that this split, this second split, doesn't actually, you can't change the size of it. So in theory, I can only have 2 blocks before and 2 blocks after. So in theory, if I did 2 amps split in this way, I could put a drive or something beforehand, but then I could only put something before this. Whilst you've got 12 blocks, in some ways it's slightly more limited than it suggests. Now the issue is that I've now run out of blocks before both amps, right? You can't really make the most out of the DSP there because of this particular layout. And then again, if I want a delay and a reverb at the end, go for stereo tape delay, and then something like a cloud reverb, and then I'm out of things again. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 blocks, which is what you could put in the HX Stomp. You can do, move this onto path B, and then move these right up next to each other, and then we've still got all of the blocks free that we could use here. So what did we do in this other preset. We had a gate on, which I can do here without using a block. Distortion, let's, I don't know, choose something. Valve driver or top secret OD, just with a bit of a lower gain. Then I've still got a few blocks in front, and then we had a delay, didn't we? Stereo, transistor tape, and then you can see now though, this is kind of where it, again, it's sort of that thing where which do you want, because this is kind of run out of DSP now anyway, because I've chosen 2 amp models, 2 cabs in there. So in theory, whilst this is a more flexible grid, I can't run necessarily as much to make full use of it anyway, especially if I'm doing dual amping. So I think if you're doing dual amping, probably the Hotone might have an advantage there. I'd suggest being reasonable. I don't know, what could we choose if we chose something else here instead of that? Something that takes less DSP maybe. Then we might be able to fit in something else. Chuck in a reverb, stereo. But again, you know, we're having to make some choices. So in terms of, like, choose a big hall. Now, I have to say, I think tonally though, it does sound great, especially the amp side of it and the cab side of it. So, you know, there, we just pulled up. Now, I wanted to just address effects. So let's just start by looking at the reverb, because that's one effect that I think you can really get an idea of the quality of a device from. So we'll put the mix to about 50% here on a cloud reverb, decay up nice and large. Look at some shimmer, same kind of idea. Let's have a look. Decay 70, let's again take that up nice and high and mod down. So you get the sense there's like a fairly good variety of effects. As well, we've got a fully controllable shimmer with 2 pitch elements, so that's a little bit more than what you get in the Ampero as well. So for example, the intensity and feedback and kind of a much more analog octave. That's kind of a bit janky, right? Digital octave. And then we've got chorus, classic pitch shift. What does this do? So I'd think pitch effects, I'd give the edge to Helix as well. Aside from that, they're roughly pretty comparable, particularly the amp. I guess one other thing in favour of the HX Stomp is that this you have a gate built into it, so that's kind of useful. But yeah, I think when it comes down to amps, if you take a look at the amp list as well, they're roughly quite similar. You've got Dumble, ODS, Soloist, Bogner Ecstasy, which is not in Helix, Marshall Super Lead, you know, all of that sort of stuff. High Gain, Mark IV, REVERBS, Soldano, quite a lot of the same sorts of things. So the one area that I think maybe if you're super hot on Marshall stuff, you might end up being someone who's maybe a bit happier with where you end up with the Hotone, maybe. You've obviously got the touchscreen. Another area I think a little bit limited with the Hotone is the switching. So you can basically set quite a lot of things to be controlled by these units, so it's done based on whatever's in that slot. The other way you can do things is to assign multiple things. A lot more complicated to set up though than your foot switching in the HX Stomp world, I'd suggest. That's kind of a little bit of hands-on with the Hotone Ampero. I think I would also give the edge to Hotone for their desktop editor as well, because I think that gives you some really useful pointers in terms of what's actually being modeled, and that could be really useful instead of having to refer to something else, to have it in the desktop editor just telling you this is based on X and Y, and then you can, you know, figure out what you're doing from there. So a lot of really good points about the Hotone Ampero. One slight area that I think I'd favour the HX Stomp for would be pitch and also reverbs. You know, aside from that, I think Hotone have done a really respectable job. and they are not even, you know, the reverbs and the pitch. Well, the reverbs are respectable. The pitch effects, I think, border on being a little bit dodge, in my opinion. Let me know if you find use in those or not.